It always snows, and really tough, really admirable people persist and come here. So there you all are, selected by a process that has certified you as fine people. So we'll do, I don't know that this is really necessary, but I guess I have to say all the things I have to say. This is a program brought to you by the National Science Foundation, but the National Science Foundation does not bear any responsibility for anything I or anybody else says. Our partners are the Boulder County Commission, county commissioners, and the county government. This is part of a large project, the AirWaterGas network, the Sustainability Resource Network, and so we are enjoying our time with our speakers, and we have a fine one tonight. I should say that coming up next week, we do not have a FrackingSENSE on March 4th. However, should you be footloose, and should it snow, and should you want to prove your toughness and character, in Education 220, I will be on a panel sponsored by the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center on the academic boycott of Israel by a number of organizations. So it's at 7 o'clock. Thank you, that's an important fact, isn't it? So 7 o'clock, Education 220, and 4 people discussing how to think about the boycotts, two in favor of the boycott and 2 opposed to that. So never a dull moment at the Center of the American West. We only pick topics with strong feelings on them, because where would we get our adrenaline if we didn't do that? Then on March 10th, we have a special FrackingSENSE. Tim Wirth, former Senator Tim Wirth, and his former Chief of Staff, Jim Martin, will be our speakers. Jim Martin was also the Region 8 Environmental Protection Agency Administrator, so it'll be the 2 of them. And that is in the Whittemire courtroom of the law school at 6:30. So that is it's our FrackingSENSE series, but it's on a Monday night. And then, just so that there's never a wasted moment, the next day, Tuesday, we have our regular FrackingSENSE back here, and we have Pete Morton formerly from the Wilderness Society, talking about wildlife impacts of oil and gas development. So, in the meantime, we'll go to class and grade papers and do a few other things. So, okay, so I am really pleased tonight to introduce my friend Roger Fragua. The issue of tribal engagement with energy issues is so crucial and so episodically and unevenly included in the big discussion of hydraulic fracturing and natural gas development and oil development. So I frequently think, when we are speaking so earnestly and intensely about the role of federal, state, county, city government, we often forget that fifth and really important and illuminating crucial government of tribal government and tribal choices about energy development. So this is really an excellent thing tonight to have this opportunity. Roger Fragua is from Jemez Pueblo. He was the Deputy Director of the Council of Energy Resource Tribes. He worked in energy issues over in many dimensions, with working with companies and negotiating with tribes and helping to reach the best understanding between those units of organization. And he now has an organization called CODA Holdings, which works on getting the best arrangements and understandings for tribes who are engaged in energy and in telecommunications. He's sensible is too mild a term for this person. He's just takes in, you can put him in the eye of a storm of strong opinion, and he's thinking deeply and he's breathing deeply. So those two must work together on that. So I'm very pleased to introduce Roger Fragua, who will be speaking about natural gas development in Indian country.
Thank you, Patty. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you all for coming. I guess, especially given this weather, I guess there must be something wrong with all of us to come out in a weather like this. When Patty had initially asked me to think about FrackSENSE, and I said, "Are you sure you know who you're talking to?" I'm not going to be the person that's going to talk to you, just by way of introduction, about the technology. I'm really going to try and illuminate the tribe's role in some of the development. I've got some context and some background before getting to those points about the tribe's role in energy development, and even in advance of that, just an introduction that might help with some of the context of kind of how I got here to working with Indian tribes and how Indian tribes are working with others in that energy space. So before we really start in that area, I guess I would just really like to maybe, if I offend anybody during my remarks in any way, I apologize in advance. It's really not my intent as we start talking about Indian tribes and then the role of Indian tribes in energy to offend anybody. That's not kind of our the intention there. I do come to you from the Pueblo of Jemez. We're located in northwestern New Mexico. It's about 60 miles northwest of Albuquerque. I'm a farmer, so I farm on my land that I helped my grandfather when I was a much younger man, and my sons now help me farm on that same piece of land. So coming here with the snow and the precipitation is a true blessing. We don't have any precipitation down in New Mexico, so don't complain about the weather. This is great weather we're having here. So obviously, being a member of the Pueblo of Jemez, I'm native just like you. I think we all come, my basic understanding is that we all come from a tribe in one way or another. We all have tribal backgrounds, we all have tribal roots, we all have our tribal customs. Some of the tribes in the United States have been able to maintain their customs, their traditions, their lifeways, their song, food, dance, ceremonial, governance, and other tribes have not. I walk on this planet along with you. And we call ourselves Earth people because we walk on top of this earth. We all care very deeply in one way or another to varying degrees about that earth. I was raised by my grandmother who passed about 5 or 6 years ago. She lived to be about 99 years old, and she really taught me a lot. As I grew up in Jemez, I grew up in an adobe house that my dad built. We'd walk across the street as kids to go to the restroom before we went to bed in an outhouse. And there were, we still use wood for cooking and heating in our home today. So to help bring context to when we all think about out of our own sense of reality, sometimes we all operate out that way and thinking, well, I grew up in a house without plumbing. I still live in a house that we use wood for cooking and heating, don't you? I'm assuming that in my sense of reality, in my universe, that's the way we people operate. I'm not so sure that is in your sense of reality. So in your sense of reality, maybe it's a different set or a different context. So as we come together and we meet each other, I think it's really important to share that context, because I think that as we think about tribes institutionally, we think about other governments, we think about industry, we think about development, perceptions or ideas about development. It all starts with that orientation. My understanding is it starts off with that orientation as individuals. So as individuals, then it'd be really nice to try and meet each other about that sense of orientation. So the Pueblo of Jemez is again located in northwestern New Mexico. We're one of 560 federally recognized sovereign nations in the United States. I'm one of 2.5 million Indian people who are in the United States. Our tribal populations are growing 4% per year. People talk about the Latino or the Hispanic population and how expansive and how fast that's growing. We're actually, as Indian people, we're actually growing much faster than those other populations. And that's organic growth. That's not growth that's coming in from another state. People who typically live on Indian reservations are members of that particular tribe. So with that kind of expansive growth, it's a true blessing, because at one point in history we were called the Vanishing American, and now we're growing at 4% per year, doubling every 25 years. So that creates a sense of both opportunity and challenges for Indian tribes. And I think that context, in terms of where are tribes' heads at, where are they at on this subject or that subject, sometimes tribes are putting out fires just dealing with issues around their own tribal membership. That's how busy things are as Indian tribes. Speaking to a class a little bit earlier today, a lot of the students were asking about kind of their orientation or their perception of Indian people. And sometimes I think we're relegated to a postcard with beads and feathers as something in the past of, something of Western icons or those kinds of things. Or sometimes we're looked at in the new world about, we're the new rich that have casinos and it's a $27 billion a year industry and all tribes must have a casino, right? Really, most Indian people are really in between that. They're not on those ends of, some historic relic or the new rich. It's really, we're Indian people. I'm an Indian person just like you. I function just like you in terms of our operation daily, kind of going through work and through life and school and that kind of thing. Our tribal ceremonies maybe are a little bit different in terms of what makes American Indians a little bit different. It's not just our political jurisdiction. It's not just our issues around energy. It really is our language, food, song, dance, some of our ceremonies that we've been able to protect and preserve that make us really unique. I think that Indian tribes make up about 90% of America's diversity. I travel about 3 days a week, going to some city, navigating through mass transit, getting off a plane, getting into a cab, getting onto into the hotel, and finding my way to a meeting, past the rental car counter, and those kinds of things, and getting. So I do that 3 days a week in different cities all across the United States. But when I work with the Indian tribes I work with, I'm very cautious. I'm cautious because I don't know what is that tribe's custom, what is that language, what is that governance structure. What is their ceremony? Is there ceremony going on right now? I have no idea what's happening in that tribe, so I try and be a little bit more respectful and cautious in my approach to dealing with those Indian tribes because it really is so diverse. So I've learned a lot by dealing with, in my daily work, dealing with Indian tribes. Patty was asking about the education background, and I had her tell her that my grandfather didn't go to school at all. Never stepped one day in an institution of learning. My dad went to Santa Fe Indian School up until 6th grade. And he rode a single-speed bicycle from Santa Fe Indian School all the way back to the Pueblo of Jemez, which is about 60 miles, as a 6th grader, and never went back to school. So I went to 2 years of college. My son graduated from Lakewood High School in the International Baccalaureate program. My daughter was just inducted last week, I'm so proud of her, into the National Honor Society. So over time, over generations, we're slowly building our capacity. I don't think I'm very unique. I don't think I'm any different than a lot of other Indian people. I don't think our family's unique from other Indian families. I spend a lot of time with tribal leaders. I spend a lot of time with tribal institutions and tribal people. And I think that there certainly are extraordinary people in Indian country with high academic degrees, but I think that, I'm representative of many of the 2.5 million Indian people that are out there. And over generations, we are learning and we're also teaching. And I think that when we learn and we teach together as Indian people with other people, I think we have things to teach, we have things to learn, you have things to teach, and you have things to learn. So people that have been really inspirational, is one of them is my Uncle Jerry. My Uncle Jerry is 85 years old, very proud, Korean War, World War II veteran. He came back in his day from World War II, and he came back into a tribal community. He had been on a destroyer out in the Atlantic, he had been to Germany. So he'd come back after traveling the world, back to the tribal community where he came from. And his generation really were a little bit different than the generation that he had left. So when he came back into that tribal context and said, fire, we could have fire in the house, we could bring electricity in the house. The REA was talking then about stringing cooperative lines of stringing electricity into rural America. And he talked about bringing plumbing into the houses. And we had cultural, I'm not going to say taboos, but there were cultural reasons why we didn't bring fire into the house and why we didn't bring plumbing into the house. His generation, when he came back from World War II, was saying, no, this is a great thing. We could have electricity. We could have lights. Long story short is that his generation, the younger guys, won the debate. They brought fire into the house. They brought electricity into our Pueblo. And they never could have imagined the progress. Addie and I were talking about progress the other day, and the progress that you bring into the tribal context and tribal community. And some of this will have some relevance about what we're going to talk to about fracking, because it's all in the context of, you know, progress and energy and development. But when my uncle's generation came back from World War II and they were talking about progress, bringing fire into the house, this time of year is when we tell our migration story. It's only in the wintertime that the uncle typically goes to the nieces and nephews. They enjoy a good dinner. And after the dinner, they sit by the fireplace, and the uncle then tells the nieces and the nephews the migration story. Where did we come from? Our journey along the way, and where are we going? It's only in the wintertime can you tell the whole story. So it's with a fire and a good meal and with patience, and year after year, pretty soon that nephew now knows the story, and he's old enough, and he's an uncle, and now he can tell those stories because he's had that story year after year. We're not telling those stories anymore. Progress. Our kids have an iPod, they have a television, they have a radio, you know. So when I hear tribal leadership talk about 7 generations, they talk about 7 generations in a sense that is, could my father, his father, his father, his father, his father have predicted that I would be here with an electric microphone, with electric lights, talking to non-Indians, with an iPhone, with technology, and all this wonderful progress we would have? And where are those stories? Where's the migration? So in terms of cultural preservation, and in terms of progress, my uncle says, be careful what you do with your work. So now he's 85. He was a young man once. The young people are the ones who said, progress is good, let's bring fire into the house. He could not have imagined that winning that cultural debate about bringing fire into the house would have these kinds of effects. Had he known that, he probably would not have even had the debate. They probably wouldn't even have the discussion. But since they had the discussion and they brought progress, so I only say that because I think when we start thinking about progress and energy and development and those kinds of things, it's with my uncle's words that I try and temper my enthusiasm, my passion about working with tribes and progress and those areas, that I try and be a little bit cautious as well, because it's the unborn generations, I think, that we think about what ramifications, you know, what are we going to cause today that other people are going to have to come into the new generations coming behind us. What are they going to have to deal with? So my goal really this evening is not talking about FrackingSENSE in a very technical way. I'm not the person to do that. You've had a whole list of really great faculty that have done that in the past and will continue to do that in the future. Really my goal is just to really introduce you to Indian people, Indian tribes, in the way that typically maybe there's some thinking about how we might relate to energy development, mineral development, and maybe more specifically hydraulic fracturing. So again, I think that I've served my tribe as the tribal administrator, and in my tribe, every tribe is different. Remember, we make up 90% of America's diversity. I was telling somebody earlier that we truly live almost in a communist state at the Pueblo of Jemez, because we don't vote. So we don't have a constitution. We don't have elections. The traditional leadership who is put in place for life, they're installed when there's a vacancy, they're installed through a traditional process, they're put in place for life. The traditional leadership appoint the secular leadership into place. There's 36 officials that they put on December 28th or 29th. The traditional leadership appoint the secular leadership into their positions. It's an induction into civil service. You cannot refuse. There's nobody who has refused in modern times. There's people who have taken the position, they haven't done anything with it, but you cannot refuse. But I'm traveling 3 days a week. I'm sitting here with my friend Patty. I can't do that. I've got other things to do. My career path is this. I'm doing something different. No, you're going to come home and serve. So I have had to serve my community as a traditionally appointed official in the past. So when our tribal government, and again, just to kind of illuminate, you know, what's the difference about Indian tribes? How is that different from the state of Colorado or the city of Boulder or the city council? Could they impose an induction into civil service and say, you need to serve as a city council person? So you have to, when you come from my tribal community, you have to mind your P's and Q's. You have to be ready to accept that responsibility because you never know when you're going to be called. So you have to live your life in a way that is of, giving to your community. So I've served my tribe as the tribal administrator. I've served my tribe as a traditionally appointed official in the past, inducted into that civil service. I've worked for Western Governors Association. I've worked for Enron as manager of American Indian Affairs. I've worked for the Council of Energy Resource Tribes for about 18 years in one fashion or another. And I've started my own consultancy in 2007 to really support other tribes in their, really in the energy space for their energy development. We start thinking about tribes and energy development, again, out of our own sense of reality. What does that mean when you say energy? So somebody might think about, oh, you're talking about wind turbines and solar panels, or you're talking about electric generation, or you're talking about, hydraulic fracturing or oil and gas or coal. Well, to some tribes, the answer is yes. It's all those things. And to other tribes, it's this or that. So when you start thinking about supporting tribes in their energy development, it really is the whole gamut from raw resource, generation, transmission, distribution, energy use, energy efficiency, kind of the whole gamut. And that's really where tribes are at. Tribes are really all over the map, and that again is the diversity of the 560 tribes of dealing with energy on a big picture holistic basis. So that's where I spend my time. And focused in that area. I've spent a lot of time here lately on the electrical side of being able to try and help deliver electricity to Indian tribes, the $27 billion a year gaming industry. The second biggest cost associated beyond the human resources is the tribe's energy use. The tribe's energy use, you can imagine that these computers that are really gaming machines, or that are gaming machines that are really computers, they use a lot of energy, they create a lot of heat, and they consume a lot of electricity. So tribes are consuming a lot of electricity in that space, and we're working at trying to, even though they're sovereign nations, we're working with those tribes to be able to transact and to purchase power from other tribes, sovereign to sovereign, and we have to deal with state utilities. And the state utilities are saying, especially in Southern California, we're not so sure we want that to happen. But we're sovereign. I mean, why can't we transact and have a tribe to tribe and swap energy and those kinds of things? Does Canada and Mexico do that? Does United States and Mexico do that? I mean, do other sovereigns, does two states do that? Do they have interstate pipelines, interstate transmission lines? Why would it be different for an Indian tribe to do that? And if we're sovereign, who makes up the rules and who gets to say yes or no if that can or cannot happen? So those are the kinds of things that I'm dealing with. So when you start thinking about the big picture of Indian energy, you start thinking about land tenure. So you start thinking about this piece of land that's called an Indian reservation or tribal lands. Characteristics of that Indian land could be it's federal Indian land, so there's federal trust land. And federal trust land means that the federal government helps the tribe manage those lands. And sometimes there's a difference on management of that land between the Indian tribe, the owners of the land, who have had that land since the beginning of time, and the federal government who says, well, this is what you can or can't do with that land. This is our advice. This is our, our trust responsibility to help counsel you on use of that land. So there's federal trust land. There's allotted land. Allotted land is, I as an individual Indian on this reservation own this land, and the big brother tribe can't tell me what to do with that land. And then there's fee simple land. So tribes are in the process now of reacquiring their own ancestral lands with some of those gaming dollars. They're going back to, at what we call a tribal price, they're going back and buying their own lands that were stolen from them, fair and square, in a number of different instances throughout American history. Tribes are having to go back and buy that land back. And they're buying it at an Indian price. And the Indian price is, oh, you have a tribal casino, real estate values just went up. It's a buy and sell, so if you're willing and you have the dollars to be able to pay for that escalated price, you're going to pay the higher price. So that's what tribes are doing. So you start thinking about land tenure. So you've got trust, allotted lands, fee simple, but nowhere in that land tenure does it say that these lands are public lands. When you start looking at federal policy, you start looking at state policy, and all of a sudden tribes get lumped into, oh, those lands are federal lands, those lands are public lands. That's somebody else making a determination for an Indian tribe about its own lands without consulting with the tribe. So we have policymakers in the federal government that are questioning. There was a Section 1813 study in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 had two competing pieces of legislation. One was the Section 1813 study said, well, the big utilities in the United States said, if that land, the federal Indian land, if it's really federal land, we should be able to condemn that land, much like other federal lands, like BLM, Forest Service lands, for use of transferring electricity or natural gas across those lands. So we should be able to condemn those lands, even though they're Indian land, it's federal Indian land, let's just be able to condemn those lands. And the tribe said, no, these are our lands, so the tribes had a big pushback on that piece of legislation. In the same Energy Policy Act of 2005 was TERA, Tribal Energy Resource Agreements, that says the tribes should be able to assert their own jurisdiction and be able to develop their own mineral resources and be able to decide their own laws. In the same piece of legislation, you had two competing pieces of legislation that were on the subject of Indian tribes. One said, you're not sovereign at all, we're going to be able to condemn your lands. Oh no, you're so sovereign, you should be able to make your own rules. So when you start thinking about legislation and policy and how outsiders or who non-Indians think about tribal lands, that's the kind of reality that we live in. As Indian people, as tribal leaders, it's that kind of discussion that happens time and time again. So you start thinking about the federal trust responsibility and the oversight that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, Endangered Species Act, think about the whole host of federal policy, federal interaction, and that federal policy and interaction is not typically says, how can we as the federal government support you as a tribe to be more sovereign? Historically, it's been, how can we limit your sovereignty and start taking away your tribal jurisdiction and limiting your tribal sovereignty on a piece-by-piece basis. There are more matters of Indian nature before the U.S. Supreme Court than any other matter. So there's a lot of dealings in the legal sense, in a legislative sense, in a political sense that tribes are having to deal with to protect their own lands, their own customs, their own traditions, their own governance, and their own jurisdiction. Taxation. Taxation is a big issue related to energy. On the Hickory Apache tribe, the Cotton Petroleum case, federal government said in the Supreme Court case decision that if the tribe wants to assert its jurisdiction over its own land in regard to taxation, the state of New Mexico will also. So now we have triple tax. You have federal tax, state tax, and tribal tax. What company is going to do business on an Indian tribe with triple tax when they can simply go across the fence and do business with two taxes? So that's why you see the mineral production happening off reservation. So if you think about the basin or the resource as a big bowl and the tribe's land is just one piece of that, where does it matter where you put your straw in to extract that resource? If you're going to, especially now with hydraulic fracturing, we can get a drill bit to go a mile down, 2 miles across, and under triple tax, why would we do business with an Indian tribe? Why would we do business on Indian tribal land? We should be able to do business off that land and only pay the two taxes. Renewable energy tax credits, those don't apply to Indian country. They apply to everybody else. So everybody else gets tax credits for putting up wind turbines and solar panels and on for renewable energy. Tribes are non-taxed entities. We don't have that. So then industry says, well, we're not going to come to you and develop on your land for conventional fuels. We're not going to come to you and develop on your land for renewable energy because of taxation. So you can see that sometimes the sovereignty that we have in terms of our ability to develop our own resources is not just a political issue. It's a financial issue. It's a taxation issue. We have 20% of America's fossil fuel resources or conventional fuel resources reside on Indian land. We have an unenumerated amount of renewable energy resources. Where's the development at? We've contributed to America and her appetite and her need for energy resources. But our growing population, again at 4% per year, we need that energy. We'd like to grow our economies. We'd like to grow our communities. We would like to have, the kinds of things that everybody else has. We were talking on the way over about Bill Gates and Khan Academy and, really being able to deliver to distance learning. I have no idea what Bill Gates and Dr. Khan are going to do, but I think whatever they're going to do is going to be revolutionary. It's going to be very exciting if you have access to the internet. If you don't have access to the internet, then whatever they're doing is not going to be applicable. It's not going to be for us. 40% of the Navajo Nation does not have electricity. Today, 2014. Largest tribe in the country. They sit on top of coal resources. They walk underneath transmission lines. All that is exported off reservation. So the real value add, the raw resource, the generation, the opportunity that makes Southern California scream, those coal resources come from the Four Corner area. Yet 40% of the Navajo reservation doesn't have where the resource is coming from, doesn't have access to electricity. I'm still using wood for cooking and heating in 2014. That's the difference in terms of our orientation. That's the difference in terms of the context. So I think it was really important to maybe go through that, pieces of thinking about, the context or the orientation for a discussion like this about energy in the big picture sense, because we don't have the big generation plants on our land. Look it up. The Four Corners plants are just off the Navajo reservation. Environmental liability still spills over. The water still gets sucked from the Navajo reservation. But Navajo doesn't have jurisdiction over those Four Corner plants. So you think about the large transmission lines that converse across tribal lands, whether they're pipelines or transmission lines. Again, those transmission lines, we walk underneath those. We don't have an interconnect. We don't have substations. We don't have our own tribal utilities typically. So we're not accessing the kind of utility and the kind of energy that everybody else enjoys. So I think that when you start thinking about that in terms of the context of energy development in the big picture sense, there's the historic perspective. And for many, many tribes, the historic perspective, and it's dealing with energy. Remember, we were talking about the Bureau of Indian Affairs, negotiating away our own resources, negotiating away those leases that are tied to production, held into perpetuity. Those resources are gone. The tribes inherited this really bad deal by the Department of Interior. So there are many levels of theft of our resources. And if you think about just the outright Indian wars of the late 1800s, and then you think about the reservation area of, okay, so move over here on this land away from the gold, silver, coal, natural gas, rivers, forest, those kinds of resources. We'll put you on the reservation over here. Even though those were our ancestral lands, we have traditional names for those peaks and valleys and rivers and lakes. Then you think about those treaties that were in place. Then you think about the Department of the Interior negotiating away our rights to our own resources, giving them to companies. And there's nothing we can do about rebuying those leases out. You think about the misaccounting of the BIA trust accounts. So the Cobell lawsuit was the Department of Interior had never reconciled that checkbook of those trust funds. And those trust funds have never been, those accounts had never been reconciled, so nobody really knew how much money was owed to those Indian allottees based on royalty payments that were never accounted for correctly. So recently the federal government says, well, here's an accounting of $3 billion that can be spread out all across Indian country. We're not so sure if that number is correct or not. That's the whole point, is we didn't really know what that number was. So it's those kinds of resources, I think, and there continues to be, again, attack after attack on those resources. So that was the basis for the Council of Energy Resource Tribes. The Council of Energy Resource Tribes, which started off in 1975, was for all those historic reasons of trying to protect the tribe's resources and the tribe's right to develop and manage those resources on its own. It was President Nixon who said self-determination. So President Nixon, from an Indian perspective, was a great president. But if you think about him from an American perspective, who knows? But President Nixon held the first White House meeting. President Nixon is the one who first started talking about self-determination, tribal sovereignty. So when we start thinking about that kind of interaction, that started off in 1970. The Council of Energy Resource Tribe started off in 1975. Through the 1980s, we started developing a better relationship with the federal government on federal policy. 1990s, we started accessing federal electricity and Western Area Power Administration allocations. In the 2000s, we started looking about energy efficiency, renewable energy, and then the organization died. The organization died because the federal government, Department of Energy, chose not to fund this national premier intertribal organization. At the same time, the federal government chose not to fund the National Tribal Environmental Council, the sister organization to the Council of Energy Resource Tribes. You had two national Indian organizations that were very important to Indian country and protection and the development of its resources. The federal government, who had historically been funding those entities or those organizations, chose not to fund those organizations anymore. It was a rounding number. The $1 million or $2 million that the Council of Energy Resource Tribes received under the Renewable Energy Efficiency Program was a rounding number relative to the $15 million they spent, the Department of Energy spent going abroad and looking at places like South America, Central America, those kinds of things. And here we are, the first Americans, 20% of America's fossil-free resources, a numerator amount of renewable resources, and we couldn't get a few $1 million from our own Department of Energy. So you think about, what else was happening in the 1970s, along with that energy development. There's ironized Cody rolling down that polluted stream that started the U.S. environmental movement. That was an Indian icon. I don't know if it was an Indian person. Could have been an Italian actor. But it's that Indian icon that really is attached to, we're the first environmentalists. We're the stewards of Mother Nature. We're the stewards of these lands. So how do we set up those environmental programs? Every state in the union is funded by the Environmental Protection Agency. Not every tribe is funded by the Environmental Protection Agency. EPA says go negotiate it with the state and see what kind of dollars you can get from the two tribes that reside here in Colorado. Maybe you have to negotiate with the state of Colorado for funding through EPA for their environmental programs. Or they have to self-fund themselves, which they currently are doing. So what's happening in present day Indian energy? Again, we've got two big sources of our economy. Obviously, Indian gaming is one. Contracting with the federal government is another one. So those are two big pieces of our tribal economy. Again, remember, we're growing 4% per year. So our community development is growing. The infrastructure really needs to grow. There's no dollars for water, wastewater, stretching the electric lines. The way we develop electricity, where I come from, the Pueblo of Jemez, we work with the rural co-op, and the rural co-op at $1,100 per pole. If I live 3 or 4 poles away from where the current electricity is, I have to pay for that. I as an individual homeowner have to pay for that wire to be stretched, only to get 10.6 cents per kilowatt hour electricity that sometimes is not very reliable or pretty spotty. So that's where my reality, that's where we come from in terms of our accessing energy. That's the reality, is we have to pay for it at that rate. And so that's why a lot of our tribal communities don't have access to that electricity. So tribes are really interested in tribal sufficiency, and tribes, we help a number of tribes all across the country looking at energy planning. The energy planning they're looking at is accessing federal power allocations, looking at third-party power, as I described earlier, looking at self-generation. Some tribes, the Morongo Band of Mission Indians, they had a dispute with the utility, and they said, look, we're just going to build 12 megawatts of power inside of their tribal land, and they did that. So some tribes are looking at in-the-fence generation of electricity and just running their own utilities. So that's not, they don't go to Excel and say, hey, we're going to consume this much power, can you just plug in and serve us? There's jurisdictional disputes. So when you start thinking about that, energy efficiency, tribes really at the end of the day want to own, develop, operate their own energy resources. That truly is the tribal vision, and that's really where tribes are headed. Some are all over the map in terms of kind of their success and kind of where they are. So what are some of the challenges to that vision? Really, one is just overcoming history. Overcoming history of some of the history that I cited previously about interaction with the federal government, interaction with industry. So overcoming history is a challenge. Jurisdiction issues that tribes have to deal with feds, state, other local municipal governments, industry running to the federal government saying, we ought to be able to condemn tribes' land so we can have a right of way. So tribes are always challenged with those kinds of issues. Money. Tribes don't always have the money. We're not all the $27 billion gaming industry. Most of us are not. The majority of the tribes are still recognized of some of the poorest counties in the United States. We still represent a lot of the poverty in the United States. Time. We're challenged with time on making decisions. Sometimes our tribal decision-making process doesn't fit or coincide with corporate America or federal government timeline or other government. Our decision-making maybe process is a little bit different, a little bit more intent. Our tribal leaders are putting out fires of truly life and death related issues. So if we don't get to that energy decision or respond back, then it's not because we're sitting around twiddling our thumbs. There's other priorities that are much higher level priorities. We have competing priorities as well. Where tribes are not just a government, tribes are businesses, but we're also families. So when you start thinking about that in the context of the bigger picture, we have competing priorities to deal with, and sometimes dealing with that frack policy, or what is Colorado doing, or what does this company want to do in terms of its development on our land using our resources. So we have other competing priorities to deal with. I think one of the more important ones is human resources. One of our biggest challenges in Indian country is our human resources. Our human resources is, if you look at the Great Southern Ute Indian Tribe and the kinds of things they've done, it's taken them 30 years, but they've been able to develop and invest in their human resources. And that truly is the most valuable resource in Indian country. It's our human resource. It's our generations coming behind us. And having opportunities like my daughter to be able to go to school and go to college and to do the kinds of things maybe that her dad didn't get to do. So that's going to take time to be able to get through that process. It's going to take us a generation to get through that process. But human resources and human capacity is one of our biggest issues. You'll see a lot of non-Indian professionals working for Indian tribes. Well, as we grow our expertise a generation at a time, a person at a time. Environmental issues is a challenge. And again, you think about, the 50 shades of green of the American environmental community of how green are you? Those kinds of things. Well, you're supposed to be really green because you're an Indian person, you're an Indian tribe. And what does that mean? I mean, if you think about tribes should be relics on postcards and become national parks, and they shouldn't have any development, then where do our people go? Where do our people go to work? Where do they go to school? Where do they live? So balancing that difference between, as my uncle did, between progress, fire in the house, development, and cultural preservation, our customs and our traditions, that's really a tough balance. So are we doing that here in Colorado? Are we doing that as a community if we call ourselves the Colorado community? Are we doing it in Boulder? Are we doing it in Longmont? So where do these communities that are non-Indian communities, do they have input into that process? But if you're a tribe and you're a tribal leader, it's forever your legacy. It's you and your family. It was on your watch that development happened. But I was only trying to do the right thing. I needed jobs for my people. So we did the energy deal, we signed the transaction, we had this company come in, we did that development. Well, because of you, that's your gene pool. So sometimes then, a lot of Indian people are afraid to make the wrong decision. So if they're afraid to make the wrong decision, sometimes the right decision is no decision. And sometimes that's what you end up with, is no decision. And it takes time. And meanwhile, you see progress happening, you see people passing you by, you see the state of Colorado coming out with policies around hydraulic fracturing, and we wonder, should we make a decision? Should we develop a policy like that? Should we talk to Colorado about the policies that they made? And maybe there's some transfer, maybe there's some learning we can do. So it really is tough, because as the tribal leader, you're not going to say, oops, I failed, I'm sorry, I messed up, I'll just move to San Francisco. If you get voted out of office, and tribal leaders do get recalled, forever, your gene pool, your kids and their kids and their kids will get teased on the playground in their community, and we can't leave. We can't leave because our church, our ancestors, our traditional homelands, it's not like we can just pick up and move to Cleveland. This is where we come from. And when I mean where we come from, I really mean that's where we really come from. That's where we came from, out of the ground. That's where we emerge. We have our emergence stories. We have our fundamental beliefs. This is where we belong. This is where we are. You can move away. You can go to Seattle. You can live in Denver. You can live in different places. But guess what? You're always going to come back home. You have nowhere to go. You're always going to come back home. And when you come back home, there's a role and a responsibility you have to your tribal membership. So you can't make mistakes. And we don't afford our tribal leadership the ability to make mistakes. We're not forgiving in the way that a tribal leader, that's okay, at least you tried. You know, we have that monstrosity called a power generation, or that big hole in the ground called a mine. If you make a mistake as a tribal leader, again, that follows you, not just you in your lifetime, your gene pool. Very serious issues that maybe the non-Indian world doesn't have to deal with, or maybe we're just a little bit different in that sense, and those are things we have to deal with. So when you think about, successful strategies, there are some great successes in Indian country in regard to energy. Something we call the Southern Ute model. The Southern Ute developed a plan, one human resource, one well, one operator, one project at a time, over 30 years. You become, is that a get-rich-quick scheme? Over 30 years, you've developed the ability to be able to do something with some flair. So the Southern Ute have a great idea. It's been 30 years of solid leadership through Chairman Leonard Birch. And there have been his successors that have followed him in that way. Yakima Nation up in eastern Washington, it's amazing what the Yakima tribe has done in regard to energy. And again, I talked about Morongo already and their 12 megawatts of power when they were kind of forced to do so in California. The Fort Mojave Indian tribe, Cow Creek tribe of Umpqua Indians created a jurisdictional or paper utility. So very creative approaches to solving those tribes' problems and those tribes' challenges. The tribes have come up with very creative solutions to those problems. Can they be replicated? Can they be transferred to other tribes? In some cases, yes. But again, we make up 90% of America's diversity, and the basis for that is because what works for that tribe works for that tribe. There's probably not another tribe that has those same circumstances. So when we started looking at, through the working with Patty and her great group that's been very informative and very helpful to Indian country, we've had a series of meetings with Indian country on development of its mineral estate, and more recently on hydraulic fracturing. So tribes are interested in learning more about water quality. Where's the available data? Can that be transferred to a tribe? Testing methane in water. Is there the appetite to work with an Indian tribe to come test tribal water? Evaluating all the different hazards. Looking at water quantity. The Animas La Plata project, tribes have primacy. Tribes are in drought, just like everybody else. But working with water quantity, cost-benefit analysis, all the kinds of things that a non-tribal entity would think about, the tribes are thinking about. And how can that information, that data, and that technology get transferred to an Indian tribe? Air quality. We want to better understand emissions. We want to be able to assess regional air data, looking at health effects of our Indian people. You think about what's going on up at the 3 affiliated tribes up in North Dakota and the kind of development that's happening there. Infrastructure, the social, ecological systems, policies. Can the policy that the state of Colorado has evaluated and discussed and adopted, can that get transferred to an Indian tribe in part? Can that be beneficial to an Indian tribe to start thinking about some of those policies? And obviously education, again, building our human resources one at a time. Talking about linkages with universities. We were talking with Kurt and Patty earlier about how do we start developing those linkages with academia. Other institutions do it. Can an Indian tribe have a partnership with a university, or a consortium of tribes have a partnership with a university or a consortium of universities to help the tribes do its internal thinking, its first blush analysis, its initial white papers to start, so that the policymakers in Indian country can be a little bit more sharp in their intent to start thinking about some of these issues that are downboard issues. So we've had 3 of 5 sessions so far with the tribes in the San Juan Basin. The tribes in the San Juan Basin is the Navajo Nation, largest tribe in the country, the Hickory Apache tribe, where they have the most undeveloped acreage in the San Juan Basin right now that's going to be developed. How is it going to be developed? Who's going to develop it? Who's going to be the owner? Who's going to be the manager? Who's going to be the beneficiary? Who's going to hold the environmental liability? The Southern Ute Indian tribe and the Ute Mountain Ute Indian tribe. 4 tribes surround the San Juan Basin. And when I come from the state of New Mexico, it's not me saying these numbers, it's the state economists that are saying $200 billion development over the next 10 or 15 years. With that kind of money, there's a lot that's going to happen. And can an Indian tribe participate in that economy respectfully? Can they participate in that development from an environmental standpoint, from a social standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, from an education standpoint? What's our role in that development? Or do we just sit there and watch the development happen and react to that development and try and respond to that development? If you think about what happened up at 3 affiliated tribe, again, in North Dakota, and the kind of development that's happened there with roads. Something as simple as roads. These caravan of oil tankers have dipped the roads and ruined those roads. Well, whose roads are those? The tribe says, these are our roads. We use these roads. 2 families of 4 were already killed on those roads by these caravan of oil tankers. So when I talk about life and death and competing priorities and we're busy taking care of other things, these are some of the things that these Indian tribal leaders are dealing with. So Chairman Tex Hall lost 2 whole families, little kids, in that rush for oil, in that rush for money, in that rush for development, in that rush for progress. And at the end of the day, whose roads are these? The BIA says, well, those are your roads. And the chairman says, well, we don't have money, we don't have a tax base, we're not taxing, we don't have a way to fix these roads. These were country roads that were used for cattlemen to haul cattle to market, never imagining that they would find the kind of resources that they did find up there in that kind of development. So lessons learned from 3 affiliated North Dakota tribes transferring down to the 4 corner tribes is, what are the lessons learned? What do we need to do to be a little bit smarter the next time around? Jobs, man camps, taro, right-of-way, these are all things that come with that kind of development. And not all of them, like the fire in the house, is positive. Not all of it is progress. At least not by the holders of, who have to stay there on those lands. So we're working very hard now at looking at standardization of the federal permitting process. And sometimes the federal government is much slower to process a permit on Indian land than it is off of Indian land. Vice Chairman Mike O'Gean from the Southern Ute Indian Tribe, a very experienced Indian professional, very experienced tribal leader, said it's much easier for the Southern Ute Indian tribe to develop those resources in the Gulf Coast, which by the way they are doing. It's much faster and easier for us to develop those resources in the Gulf Coast than it is on our own land. True statement. I don't mean it's a true statement that he really said that, he really did say that. I mean it's a true statement, that is true. It's much easier for the Southern Ute to deal development off of their land than it is on their own land. And they're the owners of those resources. And they're not short of financial resources to be able to develop. It's not a money problem they have. It's a time problem. It's a jurisdiction problem. It's a federal problem of having feds process, of doing their job and processing those permits. And that's stifling our local tribal economies, our local community development. With those monies, that's what affords us to look at the hospitals, the schools, those kinds of things that come with that kind of development. And if we don't get to that kind of development, what are we left with? The environmental liability? So these are some of those things that the tribes are looking to develop. So we're looking at creation of an intertribal organization, the one that was starved off by the federal government. There's not any more important time to do that than now. We couldn't get a drill bit to go a mile down and 2 miles across. We're doing that now. We're doing that all over the country. We're doing that around Indian country. And how do we do that kind of development without an equal partner on the other side of the negotiation table? How do we do that without tribal leadership kind of in tune with what's going on with that kind of development? So we need to build Indian capacity, we need to build tribal capacity, human capacity. So we're looking at a set of regulations and policies and standards, and that really is our goal of working with the center and the studies that are going on to be able to transfer some of that data and some of that information to tribal leaders as they start thinking about down board the kind of development that is coming their way. And it is coming their way. It's starting to happen in Oklahoma. It certainly is happening in the Four Corners area. It's already happened in North Dakota. It's probably going to start happening in Wyoming and in Montana. So how do we do that? How do we participate in that kind of economy and that kind of development if we're not up to speed with everybody else? And that's the important part of our work that we're doing here with the center. So again, I hope I have not offended anybody in my remarks and my presentation. In starting a discussion, I really came here to really hold more of a discussion with you, and if there's any questions or comments, I'll try my best to be able to try and answer some of those.
We do have our written questions, but I think I'm going to honor the speaker's preference, which would probably be to just have people speak the question.
Sure.
So I think I will drop our custom. I have questions. I can read the question, and then you can wave if it is your question, or you could just ask the question, because I think that would be your preference.
Sure.
It seems to me.
It would be.
So here are your questions. But
in the spirit of conversation, I really would prefer that we really would look at each other and have an exchange of our voices, and to be able to have a conversation. I think that would be best.
okay, so you know who you are. Those of you who wrote these questions, you've rehearsed your ideas and are ready to speak them. So we'll go back to the
Other tribes would consider the Navajo tribe's model of energy development a success. Like speaking both about kind of the 60s leases and what came out of that and the legacy of that on the reservation, and their current direction, which is to purchase the coal mine for the Four Corners power plant and run that through the tribal government. And not only run it, but also regulate it within the government. Do other tribes look at that, like those situations? How do they see that?
High Country News called me the other day, and it's I forget the lady's name, Emily something or another. She's called me before on matters of energy. She called and said, "So what do you think about the Navajos acquiring their own resources?" And my response was very guarded. I said, "I respect tribal sovereignty. I respect tribal jurisdiction. I may not agree with what any tribe does. I sometimes don't agree. I know this is being recorded. I don't agree with what sometimes my own tribe does. But I respectfully and humbly do respect tribal sovereignty and tribal jurisdiction. So in that then, I think it's the right thing. If that's what the nation wants to do, it's the perfect thing. So those resources, again, because of the environmental liability, the environmental consequences, they should be in the hands of an adult. And who's the adult? Who's been here the longest? Indian tribes. So the tribes are the adult in the country in the sense that they're the oldest. They've been here the longest. They're not going to pollute their own lands. Left to their own devices, tribes will always adopt higher standards than the state standards. And standards they have to live with. It's the standards they have to abide by. So, in my judgment, I think that the tribes taking possession of their own resources, whether they choose to develop them or not. A tribe could take their own resources and leave them dormant. That's their decision. A tribe could take their resources and develop those resources. And to that tribe, that is the right decision. And it's not my place or anybody else's place, quite frankly, or another tribe's place to say that's wrong or that's right. Each tribe is sovereign, and each tribe has a responsibility, not a right, a responsibility to do the best thing possible with their resources and their development. And that's a family discussion within that tribe if it's the right decision or not. I don't look at my neighbor and say, I wouldn't buy that kind of car. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't paint my house that color. That's up to that neighbor, and that's the freedom of will.
Should I read the questions? If you wrote a question, please feel free to raise your hand, or otherwise I'll go back to my old customs here. But
Yeah.
Well, your one on your road story in North Dakota, I was wondering, why couldn't the tribe have charged the oil and gas companies an access charge or something to go over their lands? Is it because Indian lands are considered public lands, or I guess why couldn't the tribes be compensated to repair the roads?
I have no idea who's in the room. I don't know what your orientation, what your day job is, what your role is. But in no instance ever is tribal land public land, ever. So go back to your homes, go back to your children, go back to your workplace, go back to your government, and at no instant is any tribal land ever public land. Those are tribal lands. So I just want to make that very clear because I can't underscore that anymore.
That's what I thought.
So, but to answer your question though, because I didn't answer your question, answer your question about what the tribe ultimately did, and they're getting pushback from that, is they are metering use of those, and they are telling the energy companies who are using those roads, they're going to impose a tribal tax based on the number of miles, and they put GPS units in those trucks, based on the number of miles, number of trips, they're going to start taxing those trucking companies. And the trucking companies obviously are not very happy about that. So the trucking companies are going to say that's not fair, and they're going to challenge tribal jurisdiction. And here's the tribe with its land, its resources, its jurisdiction, and we'll see how that all plays out. But that's kind of where that's headed. So the tribe is already imposing its own jurisdiction on those roads to try and maintain. All they're simply looking to do, what everybody else, what any other jurisdiction would do, any other municipality, any other state, any other county would say, we need to maintain these roads. If the tribe doesn't have a tax base, should it really be on the back of the poor Indian families to subsidize and support the roads for these billion-dollar quarter international oil companies? So the tribes are going to start a process to try and recoup the ability to maintain those roads in a respectful way.
well, I do have these written questions. So, oh, thank you.
Yep.
When you talk about the triple tax,
Yep.
state, federal, and tribal tax,
Cotton petroleum case, Hickory.
is there any way around, since it's on sovereign tribal land, to just impose a tribal tax? Is there any way around reducing the federal and state tax?
Yeah, and the only way to do that is for the tribe to be the developer, and all of a sudden all those taxes go away. If the tribe is the developer on its own land, of its own resources, the federal permitting goes away, the slow federal government goes away, the taxes go away. That's the way to make it work. But the tribes don't have those financial resources to do that. So why doesn't these big funds These big international funds that are investing in Ukraine and Russia, Nairobi, other dangerous places, why aren't they investing? Like, why don't they gather a fund and start investing and co-investing, developing with Indian country? Where's the political risk? We're U.S. We're U.S. citizens. We're the first U.S. citizens. These are our resources. Wouldn't it make sense to think about it from a Wall Street or Chicago banking industry or from a Houston-based energy company? Wouldn't it make sense to think about Indian country respectfully instead of saying, how can I get these resources for nothing and develop these resources? Instead of thinking, how can I respectfully partner with the tribe? What the tribe has is resources, sovereignty, jurisdiction, tax preferences. Why don't I invest in that? Why wouldn't I take a subordinate position to an Indian tribe in that? History would say there's a social pecking order and that's not the way things are done, and we're not going to do that. But somebody could break that paradigm and somebody could say, we are going to do that. That'd be a great model.
If all red tape goes away when you develop on Indian lands from the tribe itself doing that, then why is it that the Southern Ute tribe saves money and time by developing the Gulf versus their own?
The Southern Ute Indian tribe, again, they're very unique, and I'm not speaking for them. I'm only speaking about them in a limited knowledge perspective. They are very astute, and they are commingling their development with partners. They have other partners. If it's just the Southern Ute Indian tribe developing its own resources on its own, that goes away. They're joint venturing with other folks, and there's not the subordinate way of doing that. Yes?
You mentioned BLM permits, well applications on tribal lands. Does that mean they also have to comply with NEPA when they do that?
Yes.
So are there any opportunities for you to comment on the environmental documents?
You know, some tribes have looked at it, and again, it depends on the orientation of whose development is it. If it's a non-Indian energy company and their development, all those regs and rules come into play. If it's an Indian tribe and its development, the tribe already knows where its cultural resources are. They already know, kind of where that, they can do categorical exclusions and kind of put that development on a faster track. So there are ways around developing those compliance with some of those standards on a faster track if it's the tribe as the developer. And that's why I say, I think when a tribe develops its own resources, it gets better for everybody, not just the tribe. It gets better for everybody.
I think I will use some of these questions since, so we have we have some policy kinds of questions that you might not want to be the power of the universe in making these decisions, but where should fracking not be allowed and where should it be allowed?
In Indian country, I guess it shouldn't be allowed where a tribe doesn't want it to be. Where an Indian tribe doesn't want that kind of development, that's where it ought not to be. And a tribe ought to make its own decision about that on a tribe by tribe or community by community basis. And where it ought to be, I think, is where it's being invited and where the resource is. Obviously, it's a very resource specific, opportunity. So you can't just go out and drill a hole somewhere and say we're going to go, look for deep shale oil in this piece of ground right here. There's certain geological formations of where it is. So obviously, I think within that playground, so to speak, then I think there's opportunities for development. But I think we're going to have some tribes that are saying we're opposed to that. We don't want that development on our land. And you may have some tribes that will say, tribe, you ought not to be developing, you other tribe, you ought not to be doing that on your land. That's not, that's my vantage point. I respect tribal sovereignty. Not all tribes or Indian people can say that. Some tribes may be critical of another tribe in its development. So that happens too.
Do you feel fracking should be banned or not?
I think that, again, I respect tribal sovereignty and tribal jurisdiction. My 28-year-old son, Jake, who is a very active activist, he he and I are going to find each other on a fence line. I'm going to be on the tribe side, standing behind the tribe as it develops its resources in a way that it deems, that it wants to. My son's going to be on the other side of the fence, saying there ought not to be any fracking. I've watched a DVD, I went and saw the movie, I've read So as we grow and as we learn, I think that maybe it's generational, maybe that's not any different than anybody else. Maybe I was on the opposite side of the fence with my dad on some other issue. I don't know. But to me, I stand behind the tribes and their sovereign ability to develop. I come from the Pueblo of Jemez. We don't have those kinds of resources. And I think that if we did have those resources, I would strongly encourage my tribe and my tribal leadership to evaluate the air, the water, the quantity, the quality, all the health impacts, all those kinds of issues that the center and that we're dealing with on the advisory committee, all those kinds of points, to really evaluate this very, very carefully. But at the end of the day, if you're anywhere near those resources, whether it's on your land or not, with that kind of development, it's going to be around you. It's going to be around us. We're all living here together. 90% of life is underground, is subsurface. 10% of life, we all think we know what life is. We all look at each other and say, you're alive, I'm alive. That bird, that animal, that plant. 90% of life is underground. It's those microbes, it's those little bugs, it's those microscopic, but that is life. We know that as Indian people, we respect that life, we call it by name. That's life. And what are we doing to that life down below? I think time will tell. And that's what I think the center and the work that the center is doing is so important. Not important to me as an Indian person, important to us as tribes, it's important to all of us. There's a lot of information out there on extreme ends. Frack, don't frack. Develop, don't develop. Drill, don't drill. Until we get more information, nobody really knows. I think we're in the process now of learning. All of us are learning together.
And I told Ronnie and Chris to quit picking up papers, but now there may be people who do want to write rather than ask for finding out. So if you see anybody who'd like to give me a thing, so I do have just a few more here to go. I think you just did this one, but do you or your family own mineral rights on your farm? And if so, do you get any oil and gas revenue? If not, why not? But you seem not to.
Yeah, no, where I come from, we really don't have a mineral estate. And if we did have a mineral estate, that would belong to the tribe. And the tribe owns that resource, would own that resource collectively as a nation. The allottees, and there was an era in American history where the federal government tried to take the Indian from land, put them on reservations, and said, okay, well, fine, that's not working, so let's just fractionate the estate, because we're not going to deal with an Indian tribe, we're going to deal with individual allottees. 40 acres and a mule kind of development. And when that kind of development happened, there are individual allottees who have become millionaires, who have become, mineral resource holders, who are doing very well, and their educations are more than covered. So that's not me.
Who has tougher laws on fracking, Colorado or New Mexico? Or which, I guess, rather than.
I'm going to be very careful. I don't know what the exact answer to that question, because I know that Colorado just adopted some new standards. And I think that Colorado was probably going to set the pace for other states, other communities, maybe even tribes, to start looking at a set of standards that are careful in that development. So I think Colorado's ahead of maybe New Mexico and other states in developing policies.
This one may be rather Colorado specific, so we may need clarification from the writer. Shouldn't tribes in Colorado take advantage of the powers they can get by participating in the local government designee program, the LGD?
I don't really know much about that. I'm not from Colorado. The two tribes, the Southern Ute Indian Tribe and the Ute Mountain Ute Indian Tribe, who are in Colorado, I know they have strong communication with the state of Colorado and the government. I know they participate at different levels, but again, it may not be at the level that's best for Colorado, or maybe it may not be at the level that's best for the Indian tribe. Again, they're completely separate jurisdictions. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they get along, sometimes they don't, sometimes they're opposed. So I think that if you think about the institutional relationship between an Indian tribe and another government, or the relationship between an Indian tribe and industry, it's a little bit like that movie Groundhog Day, where we see each other for the first time every day on terms of, you know, how we're going to interact with each other, and depending who the leadership is. So I think that it really varies on a issue by issue, on a case by case, and even on a tribe by tribe basis. So.
Are tribal lands subject to NEPA or not?
Yes.
Do you believe that fracturing can be done in a way that does not degrade air and water quality?
I don't know. I think we're learning about that, and I think it's too early to tell. And I think that when you have the kind of new development, you know, coming from New Mexico, I just heard on the news, maybe it was yesterday or today, that the waste isolation project, you know, so we're talking about storing nuclear waste underground in New Mexico. So now we're hearing just yesterday that there were some leaks coming out of that. Well, who knew? I mean, we took all the safeguards. I'm sure the Department of Energy, I'm sure the state of New Mexico, I'm sure people have taken the highest level of precaution, but we're dealing with things that we've never dealt with before. We're going deeper than we've ever gone before. We're going farther with a drill bit than we've gone before. So I'd say that we don't know. We don't know about this yet. There's not enough time. It's not mature enough of an industry. So I think we're finding out, and I think we're all being inquisitive. We're all trying to I think we're all trying to figure out what is the correct answer to that question. I think only time will tell.
And then, this is a very comprehensive one, but maybe I will suggest that you sort of put this down into the spectrum of opinion. It's an interesting question. If all 2.5 million Native American people voted on whether or not to ban fracking, can you hazard a guess as to how that vote would go? And that would be it would be remarkable if you had the basis for that guess, but just the spectrum, you know a lot, but yeah.
So I think, you know, from aside from doing this, I think that we're all tribal. And I think that, you know, we read the newspaper, we watch the news, we've seen the videos, you know. So I think on a pan-Indian sense, the 2.5 million Indian people, many who live in very rural areas away from, you know, hydraulic fracturing activities, I think that the general consensus out there is it ought to be, if anybody's moving in that direction, you ought to move cautiously. So I think that the majority of Indian people, if they had to vote today, like the majority of maybe most Americans, would probably say no. And we don't want that kind of development. It's too dangerous. So that'd be just a guess, but that'd be my guess. I think the majority of Indian people would probably say, with limited information, I don't think that's the right resource to develop, or that's the right way to develop that resource.
At a meeting we were at recently, there was a tribal leader who spoke very eloquently about the need for economic development and the fact that he and his people prayed for the earth and its well-being, and trying to move around or between or among those thoughts. That was so could you just reflect on his statement and how a person in that situation, as you say, a tribal leader who cannot just move away and leave it behind him, how that illuminates, connects to everybody's dilemma trying to figure out this issue, but also has distinctive qualities?
Yeah, so I think that again, we kind of touched on earlier about the kind of seriousness that goes into tribal leadership and tribal decision making, and the kind of time that goes into that. And not all tribes, in fact the majority of tribes are more democracies than not. You know, most of the tribes are not structured the way that my tribe is structured. So I think that with that, then I think that those tribal leaders have got to be very, very cautious about the kind of development. But again, When you live in the San Juan Basin, this tribe lives in the San Juan Basin. His land, his resources, his people are in the San Juan Basin. You're in it. It's happening. It's a barbed wire fence away from you and your people. It's a barbed wire fence away from your aquifer, from your air. So that tribal leader has to be engaged and live in this environment, whether he has a say or not, whether he has a decision or not. You know, it's in the neighborhood. It's happening already. So I think that what tribes can do is exactly what they are doing, which is working with you and becoming very smart and trying to get up to speed on what else is happening out there and what is their role and what is the correct amount of the data and information that's out there. I think that they're doing that. They're doing the best that they can to stay at the table and make sure that that happens. I think that's all they can do right now. Yeah.
Following up from a couple of questions ago, tying right in non-Indian governments and groups, I've heard talk of the precautionary principle, and much more popular in Europe. I think San Francisco City and County adopted that as their official policy lens or guidance on environmental and energy issues. So the question would be, you know, it seems to be like they have, who are the adults in the region? Well, people have been there the longest, probably operating by the precautionary principle already. What do you see happening with trying to bring in what's more familiar in some of the non-Indian communities to get some bridge and understanding? Do you see that? In what context do you see that helping at all, the precautionary principle with any of these issues?
So we were talking about that a little bit earlier before the session this evening about, you know, how do we start building linkages and bridges and, you know, collaboration and sharing opportunities between Indian tribes, non-Indian communities, academia, industry, and non-tribal governments. How do we start developing that sense for having those kinds of conversations? And, you know, that's even having that simple conversation about who would run that, who would fund it, who would call the meeting, who would write it up. You know, you think that would be such a simple thing to do. I think that's a very simple thing to do. If we had 12 tribal leaders sitting right here in the front row engaged in this conversation, how rich this conversation would be. The dialogue, the questions, the back and forth, sometimes the debate, even the argument. But unless we have the ability to do that, all we're going to do is we're going to talk from here, Colorado's going to talk from here, New Mexico's going to talk from here, and my experience at Western Governor is I thought that this was the Cowboys and Indian issue. It's state against state, you know, so it's really this spaghetti bowl of jurisdiction and understanding and misunderstanding and no communication, when it could be so simple. So simple. Pull people together, let's have the discussions, let's share the information, and start having that dialogue and that learning and that transfer of information. So we can start learning from each other. And tribes can do the same thing. And that's the basis for this intertribal organization. And that was the beauty of that intertribal organization that was there before, is it was a intertribal organization around energy, and sometimes they would talk about energy. A lot of times they would talk about really deep issues like life, death, governance, child welfare, farming, drought, you know, important things, food, healthcare. It's the same tribal leader who can't turn it off and say, oh, I'm the energy guy. It's the tribal leader, he's the father, he has to deal with everything, he has to deal with all of his kids. He has to deal with the whole neighborhood. So unless we can develop something simple as having meaningful conversations, call San Francisco out to California, get a tribe to join in that conversation, how hard would that be? It seems so simple, but yet it's so hard. It seems like it's right here in front of us. Why can't we just do that? Well, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to organize it? Who's going to... See, you start getting into that, it's like, okay, well, never mind. You know? I mean, I'm not saying never mind like we ought to give up. I'm very persistent. We ought not to give up. It's so simple. It's right in front of us. We ought to figure out how to do it.
We've been going back and forth. We are setting up a FrackingSENSE series in Greeley. And driving from Boulder to Greeley and Greeley to Boulder makes us think about pen pals and cross-cultural exchange, and a Greeley delegation coming to visit us in Boulder and a Boulder delegation going to visit in Greeley. And it sounds batty, except it's not. It's really, that's not a long drive, but it's a drive where you really feel you have gone from one place to another. So I wonder if we were to have exchange programs of people from, and really what the precautionary principle, that would be quite an occasion for visiting from Greeley to Boulder and so on. But where would you put our priorities if we were going to start with 2 or 3 exchange programs of taking representatives from one inward-looking group to another inward-looking group and putting Indian people into that mix? Where's the best?
In terms of the subject matter?
Yeah, natural gas development, I guess. We'll stick with natural gas development and hydraulic fracturing, though I like the notion that that is seen as moving in many directions and involving all of human concerns and enterprises.
Yeah, so I think you start with a 360-degree view. I mean, we think about all of our tribal communities. You have youth involved. You have elders involved, people who are in retirement, who've been around the block, who people say, oh, they're of no value. They're of the most value. And you get young people involved because it's their future we're talking about. You get lay people who are hard hats or blue collar people. You get the academia folks. You get a 360-degree view of people who would be concerned and affected by that kind of development. And we start talking to them about the kind of learnings. What do we know? What we don't know? What do we need to know? I think you start throwing the data out there in a presentation format and say, this is where we are so far. We've got a long ways to go. But you say this is what we've got so far, and you have a really robust discussion on that. And I think that you're going to have a great perspective, a great orientation of conversation from that kind of a group. So I think that'd be really important to organize that kind of a group, and there could be Indians involved in that group. I think there ought to be Indians involved in that kind of group, because the orientation and the perspective is going to be maybe a little bit different.
Why would we not just do that online? What is it about face-to-face presence, and is there a kind of Native people's perspective on why we would want to be in each other's company and not?
I think that again, fire in the house, and you start thinking about the kids, and I don't know what they're doing, Instagram, and you say texting and Facebook, but that's old stuff now. I think there's something in the inferences in a voice. There's something in the human touch. There's something looking at somebody. When you could have a real discussion with somebody that's real, I think that that's much different than, something that's, and not to discount distance learning and telemedicine and video conferencing and those kinds of things. I think that has a place. But I think to have real discussions, to be really focused, to turn your cell phone off, to be able to look at somebody and say, I'd like to know you, and I'd like you to know me, so we know where we each other's come from. There's nothing that replaces that. I think that's so important. And I think unless we get to that point where we start thinking that we lose our migration story as a whole society, we've lost our migration story, we don't know where we come from, we don't know where we're going to go, then all of a sudden we end up where we end up. And then all of a sudden we're hollow and nothing matters anymore. It's like, what do I care? Go ahead and develop it. I think unless you have that human interaction, I don't think you're going to have the kinds of discussions that it could have been have you had a face-to-face. When you can touch somebody. There's something that's different about that. And I think this is far too important of an issue to take the cheap, lazy, fast way of saying, let's Skype, let's do a conference call. This is far too important. It's our future.
Well, that is a great last remark from an in-person speaker. That is. So, thank you.